We're now walking up to the third floor of the Toledo Club, and you can notice many of its fine features, the details on the railing, on the stairs, looking right down to the first floor, and the mat carrying the seal of the Toledo Club. And we enter up into the ground floor with a wonderful arcade leading us into the founder's room. And as we walk, we pass one of the other 4 paintings by Edmund Osthouse that the Toledo Club owns. This is a totally charming painting called First Crossing. It was actually, however, the last painting that Osthouse made before he died. It, as you can see, shows a mother dog and 6 pups along the banks of a stream, and charmingly Mama dog is trying to encourage the little pups to cross safely. Carl Stalin was the chairman of the club's art committee when this painting was acquired, and it has been placed in different parts of the club, but Osthouse is such a significant figure, and everybody who knows anything about art of this region knows the dog paintings of Osthouse. Now let's walk into the great grand founder's room, and we begin in here with a painting of Edward Drummond Libbey. I have been the 9th director of the Toledo Museum of Art since it was founded in 1901 by Edward Drummond Libbey. He was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1854, and his father was the general manager of the New England Glass Company. Bringing it to Toledo, he renamed it the Libbey Glass Company. There was an availability of cheap gas and cheap sand and cheap labor here in Toledo, and the business took off and became the most successful glass company in America, but spawned other glass companies through the efforts of, in particular, a young glassblower from West Virginia of Irish heritage, Michael Joseph Owens. They were a very unlikely pair, Edward Drummond Libbey and Michael Owens. He was a rough-mouthed person who became a rhetorician later on and an orator, but had a very little early education, unschooled perhaps. So the Libbey Company is the foundation of the name that Toledo has to this very day, the Glass City. And this particular painting presents very strongly of Libbey, and it's appropriate that it is one of the great founder paintings in this founder room, introducing you to the club. On the other side of the door, however, is a painting of Michael Owens from, as I said, Virginia. His people were from Wexford in Ireland. I myself am from Dublin in Ireland, so forgive me mentioning that. He quit school early, as I said, and started working in a coal mine. On a trip to Virginia, Edward Drummond Libbey spotted him and liked the cocky man who came in and said, "Mr. Libbey, my name is Mike Owens, and I've decided to go to Toledo and work for you." And so he did. Michael Owens is one of the great people of the glass industry, and his name today is on the 2 of the Fortune 500 corporations that Toledo has, still from the glass industry, Owens Corning and Owens-Illinois, but was also, of course, part of Libbey-Owens-Ford, it was called, and the Owens Bottle Machine Company. Michael Owens was the inventor of the glass bottling machine, which managed to make bottles at the rate of 150 bottles a minute, and completely transformed the glass industry. Owens took over the day-to-day management of Libbey Company, and he had many patents to his name. Very, very brilliant man who became a member of this Toledo Club in 1908. He died at the age of 64 in 1923. Across the room we have a painting by John North Willys, who is the president and founder of another great company of Toledo, Ohio, the Willys-Overland Company. He himself was born in New York, and he saw at first that bicycles could be a profitable outlet for his ability as a salesman. He turned out to be a great salesman. But he saw his first automobile in Cleveland, Ohio. And he realized that the automobile was going to replace the bicycle. And in 1906, he formed the American Motor Car Sales Company in Elmira in New York. They produced 500 cars at the time, and they were selling faster than an Indianapolis company called Overland. At that time, Overland Company was housed in a 300-foot-long building and it was in a lot of debt. So making the Willys-Overland Company, Willys became the president and the treasurer and the general and sales manager. He was general factotum, a brilliant man who moved the company to Toledo, Ohio. And he revolutionized the car-making industry by producing numbers that had never been achieved before. He was asked what he considered the biggest thing he'd ever accomplished, and said many years later, making $1 million in 1 year on a capital of $50,000. In 1909, he acquired another company in Ohio, the Marion Motor Car Company, and that was when the company had its name changed in 1912 to the Willys-Overland Company. It's hard to believe, but they were the second largest automaker in the United States of America behind Ford. And Willys built the 7-story headquarters in Toledo, Ohio. And then after the war in 1919, he purchased the Duesenberg Company. He hired Walter Chrysler, who was the General Motors vice president, to run Willys-Overland Corporation, and at the sum of salary $1 million a year. Willys was close to President Herbert Hoover, and was appointed U.S. ambassador to Poland, and he served there until 1933. His company went into bankruptcy in that year, and the following year he and his wife were divorced, but he married again very quickly, sadly suffering a heart attack some months later following a stroke. And he died in New York and is buried in Valhalla, New York. So this room has the most extraordinary characters of Toledo's history. And at the far end here, we have a portrait of William Edward Levis. And the Levis name, like the Secor name, is well known in Toledo, as different buildings and streets carry the name. Levis attended the Culver Military Academy and then went to the University of Illinois. But as the World War I was raging on, he enrolled in the Officers Training Corps and served with the British Army and then with the American Expeditionary Force. He was to prove to be one of Toledo's great leaders. And in 1918, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross of the United States for extraordinary heroism. Now, the Levis family was in the glass industry for generations. So like Libbey, whose father had been involved, William's grandfather, Edward Levis, had settled in Alton, Illinois, and married there and had 7 sons. He was a cabinet maker by trade, but he became involved in the glass industry in 1873. Edward Levis invested in the Illinois Glass Company, and on the condition that all of his 7 sons would get a job. And so Edward Levis was vice president and production manager, and the partner in the Alton Company, William Elliott Smith, was the president. In 1910, it was the Levis brothers licensed one of Michael Owens's automatic bottling machines, and he put it into his plant at Alton. And by 1915, all bottles produced at the plant were made on Owens' machine, and they really started to boom. The Alton plant became the largest individual manufacturing factory for bottle making in the world. Then in the 1920s, the Owens Bottle Company in Toledo began considering the Illinois Glass Company for acquisition. And the two companies were combined in 1929. At that time, the largest merger in the history of the glass industry, giving birth to what was the world's largest glass manufacturer. And so the new company was called the Owens-Illinois Glass Company, with headquarters in Toledo, Ohio, and many, many factories across the country. William Edward Levis became vice president and general manager of Owens-Illinois, and in 1930 he became president of OI, and soon afterwards his cousin J. Preston Levis took over management of the Alton plant. And he oversaw an extraordinary expansion that has fueled Toledo and continues to do. In 1935 they acquired Libby's company, the Libby Glass Manufacturing Company, and then it was renamed the Libby Glass Company. And 3 years later, in 1938, Owens-Illinois and the Corning Glasswork in Corning, New York, consolidated their patents to form the Owens-Corning Fiberglass Corporation. And that business also branched out in glass fibers to create a business known as Johns-Manville, which is today located in Waterville, Ohio. Now, William Levis was an extraordinary man, chairman of the board of Owens-Illinois from 1941 to 1950, a director until 1960. He'd been president from 1930 to 1931. He helped develop Toledo Express Airport. He was involved in so many things, including being president of the Toledo Museum of Art, which he loved very much indeed. He died in 1962 in New York City and is buried in Alton. So many contributions that this room represents. And if we go to the far side of the room, we move back in time to the 19th century to a portrait of David Ross Locke, who proposed the formation of the Draconian Club in 1882 and became its first president. And though he wasn't a member of the Toledo Club, the Draconian Club became the Toledo Club in 1889, the year after Mr. Locke died. 1882 was the year that Sam Goldwyn and Franklin Roosevelt and Igor Stravinsky and Virginia Woolf and James Joyce were born. It's a terribly fertile time in culture, of course. David Ross Locke was born in New York, but he left home at the age of 10 to become an apprentice to the publisher of the Cortland Democratic newspaper. And he had great involvement with books and literature, became one of the great literary figures. And in 1856, he decided to start the Journal in Bucyrus, Ohio, and began to build a reputation among the great literary figures of the Civil War period in America. He was so prolific, writing a series of stories, one every week for 6 years. In 1858, he met Abraham Lincoln in a hotel room and later wrote, "I succeeded in obtaining an interview with him after the crowd had departed, and I esteem it something to be proud of that he seemed to take a liking to me. He talked to me without reserve. It was many years ago, but I'll never forget it." He sat in the room with his boots off to relieve his very large feet. So during the first year of the Civil War, Locke was editor and proprietor of a weekly newspaper in Findlay, Ohio. He visited President Lincoln in 1863 after he had created a fictional character called the Reverend Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby. And the letters that he produced became known as the Nasby letters and were much admired by everybody from President Lincoln on throughout society. President Lincoln, it said, loved the stories of Nasby. Here you can see him seated on a chair, staring out to the left, a learned man who moved to Toledo in 1865 to take charge of Toledo's newspaper, the Toledo Blade. And he wanted to build it up to have a national circulation. In the spring of 1881, he went off to Europe. He spent about 2 years there. In the Blade, he wrote about his adventures and returned to Toledo, where he died at his home on Jefferson Avenue in 1888. So this room of luminaries culminates with a very distinct portrait of the 7th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court of America, Morrison Remick Waite. He was born in Connecticut in 1816 and studied Greek and Latin. Here seen bearded, seated in the opposite direction to Nasby. He became a member of the Skull and Bones Society in Phi Beta Kappa while at Yale University, from which he graduated in 1837. And then he started to study law. And he completed his preparation for the bar in Maumee, Ohio. He was admitted to the practice of law in 1839. In 1840, he married Amelia Warner, and they had 3 sons. He was a Whig until the dissolution of that party in the 1850s, after which he became a Republican. And he ran for Congress, but lost. But he was elected to the lower house through Lucas County in 1849. Then in 1850, his law firm moved to Toledo, Ohio, and opened an office with the name Young and Waite. 2 years later, he became a member of Toledo City Council, and then in 1862, he was nominated for Congress. A year later, he was appointed to the Ohio Supreme Court bench, but he declined. And then in 1971, he became internationally known through his appointment by President Grant to a tribunal at Geneva in Switzerland, which was to resolve the Civil War claims for direct or collateral damage. These were known as the Alabama claims, and gave great notoriety to Morrison, Remick, Waite. Britain ultimately settled the matter by paying the US $15.5 million for damage done to ships. Waite had practiced law until 1873, when he was elected president of the convention to revise the Ohio State Constitution. And all this detail helps us to understand the promise and the dominance of the man who was in 1874 to don the scarlet and ermine of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, which he filled for 14 years until his death in 1888, the same year as Petroleum Nasby, also in this room. As Chief Justice, he got to swear in Presidents Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, and Grover Cleveland. And here in Toledo, his name is well known for Waite High School, which opened in 1914. So like Petroleum Nasby, dying in 1888, he was a member of the Decronian Club, but not a member of the Toledo Club, which was founded the year later. So all of these founding members of Toledo's Draconian Club or Toledo Club or institutions in Toledo make the character of this great institution, the Toledo Club of Ohio. And we hope that you've enjoyed this tour of the collection.